to An Endurance of Trees. This is a revised version of a program that I delivered a couple of years ago for the Nature Festival. And I've just had a bit of a closer look at a couple of things that were in that program and done a little bit of chopping and changing. So first of all, I'd like to welcome you here, and I'd also like to acknowledge that this space stands on the country of the Indigenous people who for tens of thousands of years before us were here and thriving. Here on the Adelaide Plains, they are known as the Kaurna people. So let's start with what is probably South Australia's best known historic tree. This was taken in June 1887. It commemorates a tree planting ceremony arranged by the Glenelg Town Council to make the spot more attractive. On the left are members of the Glenelg Band, and in the right foreground is what appears to be a cloth frame, presumably protecting a newly planted tree. Now, most South Australians know that this bent-old gum is the tree beneath which the proclamation of the province of South Australia was first read. But was it? Over the years, the controversy over the exact identity and appearance of the so-called Proclamation tree had been in dispute. In 1935, the debate was rekindled in the lead-up to the 1936 South Australian centenary. In the centre, you'll see an article in the news. A correspondent had written to the paper declaring the old gum tree is an out-and-out imposter. Glenelg Mayor, Mr. William Fisk, replied that he was satisfied that the old arched tree was the one under which the proclamation was read. On the far right is a reproduction of an original drawing by John Michael Skipper. The caption reads, "Declaration Tree, South Australia, 1836. The Skipper artwork supports the recollections of Mary Thomas, a writer who contributed to South Australia's first newspaper, which she ran with her husband. In her published diary and letters, Mary Thomas states that she was present at the actual reading of the proclamation. She writes that when she visited the Glenelg site 21 years later, she was shown the old bent gum tree by a woman who lived nearby. She declared that this was the tree under which the proclamation was read and to which the paper copy of the proclamation was pinned. Well, Mary Thomas was there at the time, and she remained absolutely unconvinced. She was certain that the tree to which the proclamation was pinned was a fine, upstanding gum, not at all bent. And in support of that, this is a photo reproduction of a 1901 artwork by a man called J.D. Stone, after a sketch by J.M. Skipper. Now, the original Skipper sketch was dated 1837, at least it's attributed to Skipper. Stone's copy shows the arched gum on the left and a tent and hut on the right under some tall gums. A bit later on, the South Australian government in the 20th century, mid-1930s, produced a lithograph of the Stone reproduction with accompanying writing. Now, the writing on the lithograph produced by the government stated that Governor Hindmarsh read out the proclamation at this tent on December 28, 1836. The trees are noted as eucalyptus. Now, the point about that is that if Governor Hindmarsh, and I don't think it was actually Hindmarsh, I think it was his secretary, but anyway, if the proclamation was read at the tent was under tall gums, and you'll see bottom left on the Stone reproduction, the gum tree is quite a distance away. Further, this is one side of a hand-painted gum leaf. The artist is unknown, but it's attributed by one of our archivists to either Mary Hindmarsh, the governor's daughter, or Jack Bolitho. Here we see similar details portrayed in the original sketch attributed to Skipper, right way round, and the old gum tree. So here you'll see they're taken from the opposite angle to the 1901 stone reproduction. Here the tall gums, the hut and the tent are to the left of the arched gum and a lot closer. Mary Thomas actually stated that the bent gum tree did exist at the time, but it was much closer to the beach and her children used to play on it, and her daughter supported this. Others who were present at the event also reported that some of the 200 or so new settlers stood beneath it for shade while the Governor's Secretary, Mr. Stevens, read the proclamation, and I quote, "under a large gum tree near Governor Hindmarsh's tent, with the official party standing nearby, also under the tree's shade," end quote. However, the bent tree was firmly ensconced as the tree under which the proclamation was read. So in 1949, J.S. Rees of the Pioneers Association of SA produced a work called The Old Gum Tree Glenelg, Is It the Proclamation Tree? The Case for Yes and the Case for No. After extensive investigation, he concluded, somewhat reluctantly, that the evidence against was the stronger. But that didn't stop the Glenelg Council, the state government, or the public at large from claiming the long-dead arched tree as the proclamation tree. And this is one example. This was produced in 1960, and it's a jigsaw puzzle. The Savings Bank of South Australia produced it and called it Governor Hindmarsh's Proclamation Jigsaw Puzzle. So now let's look at another tree story. This is the City Acres map. The tree that we're about to talk about is long gone. From this early map and descriptions of the event I'm about to tell you about, we have a very rough location north of the River Torrens, close to the colony's government store or iron store. It's where that red arrow is leading. So it stood down the hill from Strangways Terrace, and you could see it quite clearly because of its size from Port Road. Now, why is it important? Well, it's significant because it had a particularly long, strong branch. And because of that branch, the tree was chosen as the one most suitable for the first government execution in South Australia in 1838, that of Michael Magee by hanging. He was convicted of the attempted murder by shooting of the colony's sheriff, a Mr. Samuel Smart. He and several companions were attempting to rob the treasury at the time. In fact, later it turned out there was only about £2 in it or something. But anyway, they also, Magee had a personal grudge against the sheriff. So Magee was aiming for Smart's head. Fortunately, he was a terrible shot and he only took off part of his ear. Wasn't too good for Magee though, because of course he could then be identified. So on the left is a detail from a larger sketch by Skipper. On the right is an extract from the Gawler Bunyip's 1865 obituary of the former sheriff, Mr. Smart. The article states that more than 500 had turned out to witness the execution, although 1838 reports cite about half that number, 250 to 300. The article goes on to say that Magee was at first dignified. Now, because he was Irish Catholic, instead of the colonial chaplain who was Anglican, the prisoner was attended by a local settler who was, like him, Roman Catholic, although the colonial chaplain turned up as well. Magee admitted his crime, but vehemently denied that he was an escaped convict, as had been stated during his trial. So far, everything seemed to be running smoothly. However, the executioner arrived in a cart and rode in seated on top of a plain wooden coffin. He was most likely an accomplice who was offered a deal if he would carry out the execution because there was no official hangman in the colony. He was disguised, and I quote, with a horrid mask daubed with white paint and 2 artificial humps, front and back. end quote. So this grotesquely disguised hangman didn't position the knot around McGee's neck correctly. So his neck didn't break, and what it meant was that when the cart on which McGee stood was whipped away, he was left hanging and choking. The hangman, realising that he'd completely botched it, grabbed a horse and escaped. So it turns into a complete fiasco. He was pursued by guards, and they forced him to return to finish the job. Meanwhile, women were weeping, fainting and screaming, and some were yelling for McGee to be shot and put out of his misery. I believe it was the sheriff who then took charge and calmed the situation down a bit. However, it took Michael McGee almost 15 minutes to die. So, now let's look at some more trees that had very different uses, fortunately. So, if there wasn't available land or cut timber, some early settlers survived by moving into a big old tree. This is a 1939 photo of the old tree at Brownhill Creek. That's its official local title, the old tree at Brownhill Creek. It shows a huge gum tree with a hollow opening in the trunk located next to the creek. That's good because you have a supply of running water, of course. The caption reads, "Used as a dwelling in the early days." This tree dwarfs the nearby trees, or it did at the time, 1939, and it must have been hundreds of years old. Here's another very well-known tree, also used as a dwelling. Some of you may be familiar with it, Herbig's tree. It's an old hollowed-out red gum, estimated to be around 300 to 500 years old, approximately 7 metres at its base. This image was taken in 1930. Herbig's tree is located on the main road in Springton in the eastern Barossa Valley, about 60 kilometres northeast of Adelaide. So the large hollow trunk of the red gum tree was the first home of a man called Johann Friedrich Herbig. He arrived in South Australia in 1855 and lived quite happily in the tree. There was a shortage of accommodation. So he married in 1858 and he moved his wife into the tree. I don't know how she thought about that, particularly when she had 2 children. And after the 2 children were born, the tree became too small for the family. So the tree is, as I said, is estimated to be about 300 to 500 years old, with a base of 7 metres. And this tree, and many like it, I'd also like to point out, had been used to shelter Aboriginal families for many, many centuries before the Herbigs came along. This isn't a dwelling, but it is of great importance to Indigenous people. According to Gavin Rees of the CSIRO, speaking in 2014, this is an Aboriginal marker tree at Choella floodplain, South Australia. In an interview for ABC Rural, he said, "The flexible branches of the young tree were deliberately intertwined so they would grow into a distorted, readily noticeable fashion, and such trees were then used as signposts for important landscape figures." And I've indicated there with 2 arrows where those branch twistings have happened. So next time you're in the country, look at the old trees and see if there's been some twisting there that doesn't look natural. And it was probably done by Indigenous people. Also related to Indigenous culture, this 1900 photograph shows 2 Europeans standing by a tree scarred with past bark removal by Aboriginal people for making canoes. It's possibly near Waikerie, Croon's Landing. And here's another. This was taken in 1965, close to Blanchetown on the River Murray, and shows another canoe tree. However, Aboriginal people weren't the only ones who removed bark from trees for cultural or signposting purposes. These images show a grevillea, or a bloodwood tree, which marks the grave of James Poole in the northwest corner of New South Wales. The adjacent Milparanka monument was erected by the people of Mount Sturt Station in 1883. James Poole, some of you may know, was second in command on Charles Sturt's expedition from 1844 to 46. Poole died in July of 1845 of heat stress and scurvy, while he was leading a small contingent of the expedition back to Adelaide. The group returned to the main camp at Depot Glen, where Paul was buried, and the tree was then blazed with his initials and the year of his death. But trees were also used as gathering places for celebration and worship for British and European settlers. So what we're looking at here, this is Father Wood's tree. It's a large gum tree beside the road which runs between Limestone Ridge and Penola, and under it Father Woods married many of the old pioneers and baptised their children. This image was taken in 1925, and there's Father Woods. He may be better known to some of you as Father Julian Tennyson Woods, and he was a supporter of the now sanctified Josephite founder, Sister Mary MacKillop, and he was famed in his own right as both a ministering Catholic priest and a geological scientist. And this is a photograph of an artwork, and it depicts a native pine tree at Pinaroo on which a plaque was placed. It commemorated the first service held by the Reverend Goss, J.H. Goss, who was a Methodist minister from Murray Bridge, and the commemoration planting and the plaque was placed 27th of August 1905. Now for something completely different. Okay, so this woman is not playing golf. Anyone know what she's doing? Okay, this is 1908 on Phillip Island. It's a camp, and she's hooking an egg out of a hole. This is late November 1908, and she was styled an ornithologist. And she travelled to Victoria with a group of other ornithologists, most likely most of them from South Australia. Now, ornithologists were very active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, they would more correctly, technically, should have been called oologists. That's O-O-L-O-G-I-S-T-S. That is, egg collectors. So here this woman is, same trip. No, you've seen nothing yet. But I'm not going to show you the rest because they're even worse. But here she is with others from the group. So note the quantities you just have of each that each had collected, and this was for just one day of that trip. Now, to be an ornithologist in this area, you had to have the means and the leisure to travel. Ornithologists travelled a lot, all over South Australia and interstate, and of course some overseas for ornithology conferences. As you can see from this 1909 image taken at Warrunda, they did not travel light. However, the one thing they did do was take photographs of their adventures. So before the advent of good quality binoculars, which was early in the 20th century, a little bit after the 1910s, I think, ornithologists, as I said, were collectors rather than watchers. And they took, all over the world, tens, probably hundreds of thousands of bird eggs. Many of those now form the basis of museum collections across the world. Fortunately for the environment and the birds, times changed, and eventually they started to become more interested in the environment because they were in it. Because they had the leisure to travel and the time, they could spend time in nature, and they started to appreciate it beyond the eggs. I'm assuming they didn't eat the eggs and simply blew them out. They labelled them very carefully. Most ornithologists had collections of anything between 800 and 3,000 eggs, all carefully labelled with the where they were taken from, what bird they belonged to, all of those sorts of things. But the images of their trips are important to us now because they show landscapes and bird life and trees that probably wouldn't have been recorded otherwise. This young black magpie was photographed on Kangaroo Island in 1905, so was a very large osprey's nest, which I don't have time to show you now, but well worth a look. We have quite a lot of ornithology photographs. Now, early in his life, a man called Robert Crompton became interested in birds, and he joined the South Australian Ornithologists Association. Robert was a very keen photographer, and he took many of the images of field trips in an album which he donated to the library. These images of gums at Mallion's Bend on the River Murray are dated 1913, and they do give us quite a good depiction, as I said, of what nature looked like. And again, these were leisured class. These were not your average working person at this stage. Ornithology became the hobby of working class people a lot later on in the century. Okay. So, this is Hans Huyssen, 1935. Most of you will know that he absolutely loved trees. He was passionate about them. And he's photographed here in 1935 among the gum trees at his home, called the Cedars, in Harndorf. The photographer was Harold Casno. So both of these men were fascinated by the natural environment, particularly gums. We'll get to Casno, whom most of you may have heard of, I hope so, in a moment. But this is Huyssen's Red Gums of the Far North. It's a watercolour on paper, and it won the Wynne Prize back in 1931, was then purchased by the New South Wales Art Gallery. And this is one of Australia's most iconic tree photographs. Anybody recognise it? A few heads nodding. Eucalyptus, I think I've got this right, Eucalyptus camaldulensis, near Wilpena Pound in the Flinders Ranges. And it's entitled The Spirit of Endurance. That may be more familiar to you. It was taken by Harold Casno and won first prize at an international photographic exhibition in 1937. The tree was 11.4 metres in girth and 29 metres high. It's often also referred to as the Casno tree. So, we talked about eggs disappearing. And of course, environment disappeared as well. This is from the very early days. Cutting Wood, a watercolour sketch on paper, attributed to John Michael Skipper, and it shows two figures cutting wood on the Adelaide Plains. The work is inscribed September 1846 in the bottom right-hand corner. The figure on the left holds a large tree saw, and the one on the right swings a mallet, and the Adelaide Plains are illustrated in the background. So, wherever people went, they needed housing. We've touched on the Herbig tree and other trees, the Brownhill Creek tree. But, of course, there was plenty of timber, and settlers wasted no time in cutting it down. This is actually Kangaroo Island. This photograph was taken in about 1870, but this hut was built in 1836, so at the very, very beginning of settlement. The Kangaroo Island settlers, some of you may know, were settled on the island before most of the ships arrived, and of course there were whalers there as well. But this is the South Australian Company's first office, erected in Kingscote, Kangaroo Island. It's constructed from lengths of timber, of course, and a thatched roof. As Australia was opened up to British and European settlement, so trees were cut down. Land was cleared for crops. Trees were used for everything from telegraph poles to firewood. This one shows the planting of the first pole of the north-south overland telegraph line. The photograph shows Charles Todd and the constructors, together with a great number of women and children. So line construction of the overland telegraph began on September 15th, 1870, but due to delays from the monsoon season, the northern section wasn't completed until 8 months after the deadline. That was 1st of January 1872. And, I didn't know this until quite recently, the finished telegraph line was constructed from 36,000 posts. Every one of those posts would have represented a tree. But it took, prior to the overland telegraph line, 4 to 5 months to get a reply to a letter from England. That's there and back. And after the installation of the overland telegraph line in 1872, it took 2 days to get a message from Adelaide to London. I mentioned firewood. This is a was actually taken on a floodplain at Waikerie in High River during the September 1917 flood. There's the SW Corowa on the left and the PS Murrumbidgee on the right with a load of wood, and there are the wood stacks, and that would have been just one set of wood stacks along the Murray. Most of those are gums. As time moved on, people got better at cutting trees. They didn't have to cut them with a saw anymore or an axe. They used a presser and a very big saw, mechanical saw. And this is a collage showing various uses of the cut timber. Top left is the remains of a flour mill. It was erected about 1840 by John Dunn near Hay Valley, and it was built entirely of wood which he hand-hewed. And the image was taken in, I think, 1919. Bottom left is a timber and fuel house outside the Laura flour mill, taken in about 1916, and again you'll see stacks of firewood. Wallaroo Mines is the centre between 1910 and 1917, and the miners there, you can see, are erecting the main level timbers. Top right is a dam made of timber and rubble on the Murray River, and the bottom shot is a railway yard at Peterborough, approximately 1926. These camels are carrying timber employed in the construction of the east-west railway line, Port Augusta to Kalgoorlie. Each camel carried 12 pieces of timber, and wide pipes can be seen in the background. Two handlers are standing near the camels. And this is an image of an artwork by George French Angus. It's actually been copied from the 19th century publication South Australia Illustrated. And this, what I'm showing you here, is the top section of plate 58, and it's titled From the Barossa, Looking Over Part of Angus Park, the Gawler Plains in the distance. The text reads, "The two trees in the centre of the foreground are species Casuarinae, so casuarinas. That to the right is a gum wattle with young plants springing near it, and the bushy shrub in the left-hand corner is the exocarpus, or native cherry. A grove of silver wattles occupy the valley immediately beyond." So that's kind of down the hill, and to the left you'll see sort of right behind the native cherry, the exocarpus. Behind it you'll see the cherry grove, the silver wattle grove. So trees, of course, also supplied food, and some of those have endured for decades under what most city dwellers would regard as completely impossible growing conditions. So on the left, this is what the Adnyamathanha people call the iga, or the wild orange tree. On the left, on the right, is the Botanic Gardens image of that same tree in the Adelaide Botanic Gardens, and you can see it's absolutely flourishing, very green, and not just because one image is coloured. Okay. Right. This was photographed in 1910, and it's the first mulberry tree planted in South Australia at Kingscote, Kangaroo Island. It was brought out by Thomas Hudson Bear on the Duke of York on July 27th, 1836, and probably planted by Charles Powell, the South Australian Company's gardener, who also came out on the Duke of York. This image on the right is very blurred detail, but it's from a colour image by Jenny Scott from, I think it's from about 2019. This is a Samuel White Sweet image. Now, Samuel White Sweet was probably the colony's foremost documentary and landscape photographer, although he did other things as well. He was many things. He was a sailor and he was a surveyor, and turned his hand to photography while he was still captaining ships. So these photographs, or this photograph, we think is of Buckland Park near Port Gawler, and it shows planted orchards and gardens with beds and paths carefully laid out. And you'll see, a bit hard to see, but just behind the left shoulder of the man in the foreground, you'll see a line of children, women and children, and we think they're the family who occupied Buckland estate at that time. We're not entirely sure. But I will point out to you, you can nearly always tell a Samuel White Sweet, because he does this amazing stuff with outlines and patterns, and he'll put things in a landscape so that they're shaped and you could almost draw around them and you just get an idea of space and of patterning. He's really, really good with that. Okay. This is the Clare Valley. As far left, you can see the premises at bottom left of a man called William C. Lucock, seedsman, or W.C. Lucock. It's just written on the veranda, on the awning over the veranda in the bottom left. And he was a seedsman, W.C. Lucock, seedsman and fruiterer, Clare Valley. He was one of South Australia's early nurserymen and an excellent gardener and fruit grower. He was also instrumental in using trees to beautify town streets. So, along with a man called J.W. Ohlmeyer, William Lucock planted oak and plane trees right through Clare. This one was Lennon Street and Victoria Avenue, Clare. He was also known as Railway Bill and father of the railway to the Clare locals because of his efforts to bring the railway from Spalding to Clare. He succeeded, by the way. This is 1936, still on fruit trees, showing orchards and gardens in the Mount Lofty Ranges. Norton Summit was named after Robert Norton, who arrived in South Australia shortly after its proclamation. The land was so fertile that it became famous very quickly for growing cherries, flowers, violets in particular, fruit and vegetables. And one of the most famous orchardist families in the area was Thomas Playford, who founded the East End Market. One of his descendants, I think his grandson, they named them Thomas Playford, so it gets a bit confusing, all of the descendants. The first son was Thomas Playford. So anyway, one of his descendants, the Thomas Playford, became the state's longest-serving premier from 1938 to 1965. Just a little sideline there. Closer to home, this large gum tree once stood at the corner of Portrush and Glen Osmond Roads. In its glory days, it was a local landmark. Any of you remember it? Yeah, I vaguely remember it before they extended the corner. Anyway, it was a local landmark known locally as the Big Tree Corner. The tree was planted in 1867 outside the entrance of Burke's Gate to celebrate the visit of the Duke of Edinburgh. Burke's Gate was the home initially of Arthur Hardy. He sold to Thomas Elder. One of his nephews, Thomas Elder, I think this is right, married a Barr Smith, and eventually it came into the hands of Tom Barr Smith and the Tom Barr Smith family. The tree was, the house, Burke's Gate, was demolished to make way for a housing estate in 1972, and this one is a watercolour and pastels depiction of the big gum by artist Robert Carrell. Some of you may know his work. The tree was demolished by the Highways Department to make way for the new intersection of Portrush, Glen Osmond and Crossroads a little bit after that. Now, good. This image shows a group of school children listening to a talk on how to plant a tree on Arbor Day. A teacher is providing instruction with the aid of a diagram. South Australia's first Arbor Day was held on the 20th of June, 1889. In the 1870s and 1880s, trees were rapidly disappearing from the South Australian countryside as farmers cut them down to make way for wheat. Despite continual encouragement to diversify crops and plant things like mulberries and olives, most farmers flat out refused. This was coming, the urge to diversify was coming really from the gentry, and they held influence in the government, and the gentry referred to the farmers who refused to diversify as savages, and they put that in print. It was interesting times. In 1875, the government created the Forest Board under John Edney Brown, who was Conservator of Forests. So Brown and a man called Friedrich Krickhoff, who was a member of the House of Assembly, were absolutely passionate about the values of trees. They believed that forests increased rainfall, which we know, but back then that was really quite a new idea. So between them, they established Arbor Day in South Australia based on the American example that was begun in Nebraska in 1872. So by the early 1900s, Arbor Day was being held in various suburbs in Adelaide, soon spread to country areas. This one is probably Taparoo in about 1913, Arbor Day, and it's a group of students, as you can see. They're actually planting on a sand dune. The other thing that trees and plants have always been associated with is remembrance. So you think of laurel wreaths, way back in ancient Greece. In Australia, during World War I, the wattle, the violet and the rose came to symbolise the war effort. That's during the war. Bunches of the flowers and badges bearing their image were sold to raise funds for the war effort. And during, but especially after the war, hundreds of war memorials were created to remember the fallen. Many of these were in the forms of avenues of trees or small parks, centred or groves. This one was quite early, 1917, was taken at Keswick Hospital, 1917, when a grove of memorial wattles was first planted, and here's a nursing sister giving a final stamp to a just planted wattle. This one, 1927, women from the Soldiers' Mothers Association are assembled at Wattle Grove for an Anzac Day service. The monument is in the middle of a wooden structure behind them. The monument is actually the Dardanelles Monument, and it bears the inscription, Australasian Soldiers, Dardanelles, April 25th to 1915. And the reason those women are all in black is, of course, they've all lost sons. It was a gathering of mothers and possibly some husbands and brothers as well. On the left, noted aviator for the time, Captain Harry Butler. The image on the right shows him flying his aircraft, the Red Devil, over Unley Oval on Saturday the 23rd of August 1919 at Unley Aviation Day. So again, this is just after the war. Around the same time, Harry did something quite spectacular in relation to a tree. He dropped it by parachute into Wattle Grove as part of a memorial planting celebration. And it was a red cedar, and there was a lot of fuss about it. It was really quite clever because he had to fly very low and drop it, and it duly arrived, it was planted. Unfortunately, it didn't survive. Maybe it's something to do with dropping it out of a plane, I don't know, but unfortunately it didn't survive for more than a few years. On the right is an article from the Mail, Adelaide Mail, 23rd of July 1932, and it's an article titled Grove in Memory of Soldiers Overgrown with Weeds, and it goes on to talk about how terrible it was and how badly neglected the whole place was. Had the tree survived, it may have by now looked something like this amazing specimen. It's a red cedar Tuna ciliata type in the Adelaide Botanic Gardens. I might just add that most red cedars were chopped down for their timber. And in 2014, the Adelaide National Trust held the Botanic Gardens tree as a tree of national significance. It's believed to be the largest specimen in cultivation in this country, planted in 1874, and it stands over 27 metres high, probably a bit higher than that now, with a 1 metre diameter trunk. So the Dardanelle Wattle Grove didn't survive. The cedar died, but the Dardanelle cenotaph did survive. It was moved first from the Grove to Lundy Gardens, also in the South Parklands, and then later the monument was moved again. Many of you will have seen it. It was moved down to the Kintore Avenue Memorial Walk, just down the hill from here. I have no sense of direction. I think it's that way. I think Kintore Avenue is that way. So if you walk down the hill towards the Torrens, you'll see the Dardanelles monument still standing. It was rededicated on 11th of November 2018. And even closer to the State Library is another tree memorial, the one on the right. It's the lone pine tree behind the War Memorial. The tree was grown as a seedling from the original lone pine, Pinus pinasta, at Gallipoli and planted on Remembrance Day, 11th of November 1991. Many people believe that memorial trees are said to celebrate life and not death, and if so, long may they endure. And in terms of endurance, I'm going to end today's program with just a brief look at a few more examples of enduring trees. This image is from a large collection donated to the State Library by local photographer Fernando Gonçalves. Here we see burnt trees in the Adelaide Hills near Lobethal, taken about 3 months after the Cuddly Creek bushfire of December 2019, so only 5 years ago. And just a few months later, around March of the following year, same scene, and there they are, growing again. It's quite a feat. So here's an amazing survivor, this spectacular eucalypt. Have any of you seen it close up? Yeah, I've got a few people nodding and smiling. Okay, this spectacular eucalypt can be found in Overbury Drive if you want to go for a little drive. Overbury Drive, Clarence Park. It's a river red gum, approximately 8 metres in girth. Now, the story is that the reason it's still there, despite the best efforts of developers, is because the land on which it stands was once owned by the Overbury family. When widow Gertrude Overbury died in 1943, her will stated that the tree could not be cut down. So when the property was subdivided and the road built, they had to retain the tree. There was no choice. I think maybe we should start introducing rules like that every time there's a subdivision. It would save a lot of problems. Okay, so coming in quite close now, Frome Road. Frome Road has long been home to some beautiful trees. This watercolour on paper by artist J.H. Adamson depicts an 1853 exhibition at Frome Road, and you can see there figures and dwellings and hastily erected tents, I would imagine, but you can see the trees quite clearly. And here's Frome Road, north of North Terrace, approximately 1909. The road is lined with 8-year-old plane trees, and they were planted on Arbor Day in 1902. So they're 7 years old at this stage. 2 horse-drawn carriages are using the road there. And on the right, here were the plane trees, the London plane trees, photographed again in 1937. So I think by my count that's 25 years later, 33 years later. In the 21st century, the trees have spread now, and the branches are forming a canopy right over the road, and the avenue is actually listed by the National Trust of South Australia. And here's another tree that's endured right on our doorstep. As you enter the State Library from North Terrace, you'll see this plane tree. It looked as if it was going to die when renovations for the library began in the late 1990s, and many of the staff were very concerned and some very, very angry. The tree was chipped right over at an angle like that, and it looked dead. So a lot of us were pretty upset about it, but it survived and it gradually straightened. And for those who remember how it looked around 20 years ago, it's a great symbol of resilience and endurance. Some of us look at it every morning when we come in, and just to remind us. And here's another, much more famous, and we're going to end on this image. Many of you will know this. It shows the much-loved Ficus Walk, or Murdoch Avenue, named after Rupert Murdoch. And it's, of course, at the Adelaide Botanic Gardens. It's an avenue of figs, now approximately 156 years old. To me, it's one of the most beautiful places in the state, and one that absolutely demonstrates the endurance of trees. So thank you for attending. And I'll just mention that given that today's final image was of Murdoch Avenue or Ficus Walk in the Botanic Gardens, it seems appropriate that next month, 16th of April, our stories from the stacks will be Young Rupert's Paper Trail. And it's focusing on Young Rupert, a book about the early years of Rupert Murdoch. It'll be presented by the book's researcher and writer, Walter Marsh, and bookings can, of course, be made via the State Library website under events. We hope to see you again then. Thank you. Any questions? Just one here, yes?
The picture you had of the old gum tree in 1949, and the people around, I just wondered if they were actors because they were all dressed in, I would have thought that the costumes looked a bit earlier than
Bit dated.
1949.
They would most likely have been dressed for the occasion, yes. Yeah, because it was celebrated. They would have been dressed in probably colonial costume or as near to as possible, yes. Anybody else? No? Okay. All right. Hope to see you again next